Hi Booktube, it's Nadine and welcome back to Widely Reading. And in this video I'm going to be talking about the 6 books I read in February plus one reading Epiphany. And I'll start with the Epiphany. And has this ever happened to you where you think you know your reading tastes, you know your reading habits. Occasionally you'll find a book that you wouldn't normally like, but that particular one you like. But an epiphany is when something in your reading habits changes drastically, just like that, and you don't know why. And that's what happened to me with rereading, because I'm not a rereader. I've never been a rereader. I check out way too many books from the library, and they're always calling to me. They're always kind of hanging over my head. The whole bottom row of my bookcase here are unread books, mostly from library book sales. And suddenly I want to reread. I don't know how that happened or why, but I can't even hear the unread books calling to me. All I see on the shelves are books that I really want to read again. So I don't know how that happened or why, but I thank the reading gods or the alien that kidnapped me and did something that was worthwhile. So let me know what your epiphanies are, if that's ever happened to you. So on to the books. First book I'm going to tell you about is The Pretender by Jo Harkin, and it is a historical novel, a really juicy one, set in the late 1400s during the War of the Roses, and it is full of atmosphere and intrigue and adventure and even some romance that is handled really well, because I have a hard time with most romance in historical fiction. And it is the story of a pretender to the throne who was a real historical person named Lambert Simnel, and it's in the late 1400s, and he is crowned for 10 days. And there's very little of the historical record for him. Not very much is known about him. So Jo Harkin really spins out a terrific story. And what I liked about it, among other things, are the characters, and especially the main character. And his name changes throughout the book as his circumstances change. He starts out at 10 years old as John, and he's a farm boy, and suddenly he is just ripped away from the farm and told he's the Earl of Warwick. His head is spinning, and it's an existential crisis for him at such a young age, because suddenly he's told, you're not who you think you are, and you're the Earl of Warwick. And so a lot of the book is him just growing up. It goes from when he's 10 till about 20, early 20s, of him figuring out who he is in the midst of all of these political machinations. And you don't need to understand all the history or know all the history. I know nothing about it, and she provides all the context that you need, and impressively without any info dumping at all, either by the narrator or by any of the characters, which is really, to me, a sin to force them to info dump. So we see the narrator is kind of a close third person to him, and so we see events mainly through his eyes, and our understanding matures as his does. Also has some great female characters, some really strong women in here. And I'd say it's a lot about identity, not just obviously his existential problem with identity, but everybody's. There's a lot of machinations, and legitimacy is another issue, gender, class, it's all here. I also listened to another historical novel called The Hounding by Xenobe Purvis, and this is set in the late 18th century, the late 18th century, in an English village, and it is about 5 sisters who are newly orphaned. They live with their grandfather, who is going blind, and this little village is under a lot of stress. There's drought, and there are a lot of problems, and these sisters are not real popular or well understood anyway. They're very insular. They don't particularly want to be liked. And they range in age from about 6 years old to maybe 17 or so. And so rumor spreads that they turn into dogs, that they are satanic. And it is somewhat of a witch hunt plot, but with lots of twists. It doesn't go places you think it would go. Great characters, and it's also very, very short. The next book I read is Endling by Maria Reva, and it was longlisted for the Booker this year, so a lot of people have been talking about it. And it takes place in present-day Ukraine, and the main character, Yeva, is a scientist. She's in her late 20s, and she cobbles grants together to create a mobile lab for when she drives around the country trying to save endangered snails. And to make money, she is a quote-unquote bride for the romance tour industry for a company called Romeo Meets Yulia. And this tour company, they bring Western men over to find Ukrainian brides. And she has no interest in being a bride. She has no interest in sex at all. She is asexual, but this is a way for her to make money. And she's just kind of slovenly and not very friendly, and so she doesn't really have much danger of being proposed to. But her picture is pretty, so they keep her in their bride catalog. So there are two other questionable brides in this company, and that is Nastya and Sal, and they are sisters. And what they are actually there for is they want to get the attention of their missing mother, who is a well-known feminist activist, and she hated this industry. And so what their plan is, they want to kidnap a dozen of these Western men and then release them at the border. And they're doing this to get attention so that their mother will see that and come back. She has disappeared. And so they need Yeva's traveling lab. And they manage to kind of convince her to do it. And off they go. And so it would be this adventure that's pretty entertaining. But what happened in real life to the author is that the war broke out. Russia invaded Ukraine, and that's exactly where her story is set. And so her problem is she can't ignore the war, but then she can't, it's going to change her story. And there's a middle section of the novel that kind of just deals with that whole thing and changes kind of the outlook and the tone of the novel. It still remains comic. It's still very entertaining. So the problems that the author faced, that wasn't the only one. She also discovered after the book was published that there's a German language novel also called The Endling, or Endling, and it's a similar story about endangered snails and women on a road trip, basically. So similar enough that she was very worried and upset about it, and she got in contact with the other writer, and they discovered that they both got the idea for their novels from an article in the Atlantic by Ed Young, and I forgot the title of it, but it was basically about real scientists who are doing this with snails, and they were both inspired, so that makes some sense. And also there's a real interesting discussion between them on the website Lithub, where the three of them talk about endlings and just their writing about it. And I'll put a link to it in my description. But I really like this novel. It is really well written. Goes from light to dark. A lot of unexpected things happen. Maybe one or two that I wasn't quite sure that they worked, but it was very minor compared to everything that goes on, and I can see why it was longlisted for the Booker. I also read The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis, and it's the last Narnia book that he wrote, but it's the earliest part of the story. It's kind of like, I guess, the book of Genesis for Narnia. And somehow I've never read any of the Narnia books. I don't know what happened with the adults around me, that this was overlooked, what happened to the librarians and the teachers, but I'm making up for lost time, and I'm reading the Narnia books, starting with that one, and it was very, very sweet. I also read Hotel World by Ali Smith, and she is one of my favorite writers, and this was published in 2001, and I think it's maybe her second novel, and one of her very early books. And I thought that Hotel World, I thought it would be almost like the TV show White Lotus, where you meet the different families and people in each of the suites and how they interact. But this is Ali Smith, so you don't get anything quite that mundane. And so it is the story, it does all revolve around this posh hotel, global hotel, and it's 5 women, and each one is a story about them. They're interconnected. It's sort of like one hands the baton off to another, starting with the first person, who is actually kind of the ghost of a chambermaid who had worked at the hotel only one day, but it's kind of a joke. She wiggled into the dumbwaiter and plummeted to her death. And that's not really a spoiler, because it's right on the back of the book in the description. But her voice is just amazing, and it is not all the book is stream of consciousness, but her section is. And I don't always do well with that, but I've discovered that what I do is I just read it without worrying about the sentences, the words, just kind of flow with it, just kind of ride the waves. And it worked really well for this, because it is just an exuberant voice. I know it sounds really grim, but it's not. She's a really exuberant ghost, although she is kind of losing her memory, losing her understanding for things, and she's really trying to just suck as much life as she can get. And it goes on. The other characters, one is a homeless woman, and she is given a room for the night by the receptionist, and she is another character who has some sort of illness, and her section is written as she is answering questions for the health service. And then there's a very ditzy kind of journalist, or more like, well, not an influencer, but I guess a journalist. And she thinks the homeless woman is some sort of rock star, and goes on kind of a walkabout through neighborhoods with her until she discovers she's not. And then there is the sister of the chambermaid, the girl who died, who is very, very upset. And hers is also a kind of stream of consciousness with a different feeling to it. And again, I encourage you to give it a try, especially just the first section, because it really is a wild and fun ride. The last book I'm going to talk about is Margaret the First by Danielle Dutton, and I think this was published in 2016 or 17. And somebody told me that this was really popular around Booktube for a while, so maybe you've heard of it. And this is my reread for the month. And it is about Margaret the First is a Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, and she's thought to be, or said by some to be, the first woman to write science fiction with her book The Blazing World in 1668, I think it is. And this is a little portrait of her, and she was a very interesting person, a woman born in the wrong time, because she was somebody filled with creativity, filled with the desire to write, but had very little education, and was often mocked for her attempts, a woman daring to write. But she persevered. She was very shy, kind of egotistical, awkward, but kind of endearing person. You really come to care for her. And one thing that's nice, Dutton gave her a wonderful marriage, a really supportive husband, and with some reason, because he wrote a preface to The Blazing World in which he praised her work and her. So hopefully that was true for her. And this was a really charming, brief, and wonderful book, and I just love the cover. It just seems to describe her so well. So that is what I read in February. That's what I epiphanied in February. Please let me know what you've been reading, if you've read any of these, any opinions, any epiphanies you've had, past, present, or hopeful for the future. And take care, be well, be good, and bye. See you soon.